This video is sponsored by the greatest place to get a website or a domain, Squarespace. So let's talk about camera settings for macro photography. In this video I'm gonna go through what settings I use on my cameras when I do freehand macro photography. And there are 1,000 different ways you can have your camera settings and take nice photos. But I'm gonna show you my settings today, and I'm gonna talk about them in terms of how they are named in Fujifilm and Sony cameras, because that is what I mostly use for macro photography. But if you use a different brand, I'm sure you will be able to find the same setting in your camera, at least if it is a mirrorless one. Just Google the setting you're after and your camera name, and you will probably find some info on where the setting is located in your camera. So let's dive into it. First of all, I like to shoot in manual mode. And that is because then I can be sure that the camera is not doing anything stupid. For example, earlier I used more automatic settings, and then for example if I used auto ISO, sometimes it would set the ISO to like 5000 and my images would be just grain. And when you come home from a photo walk and discover that, you're not really that happy. So nowadays I only use manual settings, and I think it works great because when you're using a flash like I do in most cases, you really don't need to vary your settings that much. You can use pretty much the same settings during your whole photo walk. So ISO, I like to set it to the native ISO of my camera, because that will give me the least amount of grain possible. And usually full frame cameras have a native ISO of 100. APS-C cameras often have an ISO of 160, a native ISO, and Micro Four Thirds cameras often have a native ISO of 200. Just look this up for your camera and set it to the native ISO, and you will have good photos. Of course, you're not always able to set the ISO that low. For example, if you're shooting without a flash, you will have to set it higher. And then the rule of thumb is always to set it as low as you can get away with, because you don't like grain in your photos, right? Shutter speed. If you're using a flash, you can set it to pretty much anything, because the flash is very fast. Usually the flash is like 1/10,000 or 1/20,000th of a second. And since the flash will stand for most of the light in your scene, the shutter speed will not be as important, because when the flash is not shining, which is most of that amount of time, the image will be pretty much black, and then it won't matter really if the shutter speed is super fast or super slow. But as a rule of thumb, I never go below 1/30th of a second, because even if you're using a flash, you can sometimes get quite blurry images then. And of course, if you're not using a flash at all, you have to have it higher. When I don't use a flash, I always go at least 1/200th, 1/250th of a second. Around there, I usually get sharp photos without a flash in macro photography. Many people ask me about high-speed synchronization, and I've never used that. I don't find any need for it. 1/250th of a second, which is how fast most cameras can sync without any special tricks, is really good enough. At that speed you will get a black background and super sharp images, and I never found a need to sync at a higher speed than that, at least not for the kind of macro photography that I do. Aperture. Depends of course on what kind of effect you want in your photo. My go-to aperture is around f8. You just need to think about the fact that the higher the magnification, the more diffraction you will get. So for example, if you're shooting at 3 times magnification, you will get quite a lot of diffraction. And then you should set the aperture to something wider, like f2.8 or f4 or maybe f5.6. But it also depends on how much diffraction you can tolerate. If you're going to post a photo on the web or on social media, you can tolerate quite a bit of diffraction. As a rule of thumb, if you're shooting insects and stuff, f8 is good in most situations, no matter the camera you use. Usually I go between f5.6 and f11 when I'm shooting insects, meaning a magnification of between 1 and 2.5. Set it somewhere around there and you will get a good result. Then we have flash settings. And when it comes to flash settings, usually you never have to set anything in your camera. I like to use my flash in manual mode. I like to have full control and know exactly how the exposure will be. I set the flash in manual mode and then I set the strength usually to 1/16. The strength needed of course depends on the weather and the kind of flash you use and so on, and how the flash is placed in relation to your subject and what kind of diffuser you're using. Make sure to use a diffuser to get good results. But 1/16 is a good starting point in most cases, and then just simply take a test shot, and if it is too bright you decrease the strength of the flash, and if it is too dark you increase the strength of the flash. And that's about it. Doesn't need to be more advanced than that. A quick word from our sponsor before we go back to the video. This is my website and I built it in less than 30 minutes using Squarespace, who are the sponsors of this video. Squarespace is a service where you can easily build a website and you don't need to know any coding or any design or anything like that. They have it all covered and it's very easy to just pick a design, upload your photos and build whatever website you want to build. You can also build a web shop and they have lots of features. Go test it out for free, and when you're ready to commit, use my code Widell for a 10% discount. One question I get a lot is when you're using a mirrorless camera, how can I avoid that the image is very dark in macro photography? And in all the mirrorless cameras that I have used, there is a setting to mitigate that. On Sony cameras, the setting is called setting effect, and you set it to off, and then the viewfinder will automatically be brighter if the image is dark, and it's really nice. And that is one of the main reasons it is nicer to do macro photography on a mirrorless camera than on a DSLR, in my opinion. On the Fujifilm cameras, that setting is called preview exposure and white balance, and I'm sure there is a similar setting in most other cameras. Have to Google it if you're not using Fujifilm or Sony, but this is a setting you really need. So when it comes to focusing, I like manual focus. I think it's a lot easier to use manual focus and then instead move the camera to focus. You can in some cases of course use autofocus in macro photography, but me personally, I think it's easier with manual focus. And to help you with focusing, there are two settings in mirrorless cameras that are really helpful. The first one is focus peaking, which basically is an algorithm that will detect what parts of the photo are sharp and highlight these in a different color, for example yellow or red. And this setting is usually called focus peaking or something similar. If you set it, you will very easily see if your subject is in focus or not. The efficiency of the focus peaking feature is not as good on all cameras. For example, I find that the focus peaking is quite bad on Sony cameras and better in Fujifilm cameras and really good in Panasonic cameras. That is at least my personal experience, but it always is a help, I think. I like to bind the focus peaking feature to a quick button on my camera so I can easily turn it on and off. In some cases you want to turn it off because it kind of distracts you from getting the nicest composition and really seeing how the final photo will look. So in some cases you want to turn it off, and then it's nice to have it in a quick button. Another thing I like to bind to a quick button is focus magnification. And this is also a feature that exists in most mirrorless cameras, at least all the ones that I have tried so far. And basically you can bind it to a quick button, and then when you want to see if you're focusing correctly, you can get a magnified view of the frame and easily see if the eye of the butterfly or whatever is sharp or not. And this is a feature I would never be able to live without. On my Fujifilm camera I bind it to the button on the front so I can easily access it, and on Sony cameras I like to bind it to one of the buttons besides the shutter. What about white balance? I think the most important thing is that you pick a white balance and then stick to that, because then it's a lot easier to edit the photos afterwards. And I prefer to pick a white balance that is around 5600 Kelvin, because that white balance corresponds to my flash and to most flashes. So since most of the light in your scene will be from the flash, it usually is a really good starting point. But you can of course adjust the white balance afterwards in post-processing, so it's not the end of the world if you happen to pick a bad one. But I prefer to set it because auto white balance can very often fail, especially in macro photography. When it comes to image quality settings, I personally prefer to always shoot in RAW. I like the workflow where I import the RAW files and adjust them in Lightroom afterwards. And of course, when you shoot in RAW, you have a lot more latitude to be able to adjust exposure and colors and white balance and all that. So I cannot really see a downside to shooting in RAW if you're gonna edit the photo somehow afterwards. So that I can really recommend. And finally, one setting that I like a lot is to have automatic preview of the photo you just took. Because in macro photography it is, as you know, very hard to focus and you miss focus on a lot of shots. And if you don't have automatic preview, you don't really know if you took a sharp shot or not, and you don't know when you're gonna stop taking photos of your subject. But if you have automatic preview, you will see a quick preview of the photo you just took that lasts for like a second or 2 seconds. And then you can get more of a feeling for if you took a good photo or not. Then of course, before I leave the scene, I usually magnify the photo in my viewfinder just to really check if it is sharp or not, or if I should take more photos before I'm happy. Alright guys, those were my most important settings for macro photography that you can apply no matter what camera you're using. Hope you got something out of this, and if you're not happy with your macro photos, maybe try my settings and just see what happens and see if something at least feels better or if the images come out a little better, I don't know. Thank you for watching. Please leave me a like if you did like this video, it helps this channel a lot. And don't forget to subscribe, I post new macro photography videos every week. And also please don't forget to subscribe to my free photography newsletter that comes out once a month. Go sign up at mwroll.com. And if you're interested in seeing more of my photos that I took using the settings I just told you to use, go check out my Instagram account at mwroll. Thank you for watching, over and out, bye.